Hey friends, you're listening to the Hope and Hard Pills podcast, where we are pursuing practical insight about racial justice and social change. I'm your host, Andre Henry.
I'm Corey Leak.
And Corey's filling in for Alicia on this episode. Corey's a good friend. He's a writer, speaker, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion coach in Livermore. Is that the right city?
You know what? You got the city right. All the words you used were the words I would have used.
If y'all aren't familiar with Livermore, it's in the Bay Area. So he's NorCal, SoCal, California connection happening right now. And today we're really excited to talk about Reema Zaman, who is an author, a writer, an actress, and producer. Yeah, she's producing some stuff right now that's really exciting. Actually, she's working on a screenplay for her book, I Am Yours, which we're going to talk about today. So there's so much for us to talk about around Reema's work. Obviously, we want to talk about toxic masculinity, since she talks a bit about a lot of encounters with men that she's had in the book that were for everything from abusive to or unhealthy to abusive is what I was going to say. And also just finding the courage to be and turning your pain into your purpose in life. Well, not that your purpose would be the pain that you had, but turning that into a mission of some sorts and finding your voice through all of that kind of struggle. So without further ado, here is Reema Zaman.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
Hey, Reema.
Hi, Andre.
I'm so glad that we're finally getting to do this again.
Me too. We had so many. Oh my gosh. It was like a journey getting to this recording date.
We have to talk about your book, I Am Yours, which I have been seeing so much buzz about the book, and it's so encouraging. And so, you tell your story in the book. So I think that's a perfect segue. Tell us about I Am Yours.
Thank you. And it is really encouraging to see such a buzz in like a social scientist way, isn't it? Because it is the first book to ever be written and published by a Bangladeshi woman that speaks on assault, abuse, and the path to resilience and owning the power of my voice. And so on a historical level, it is the first of that. And the best thing about being the first is it makes it possible for there to be a second and a third and a fourth until we lose count, because there is no more need to keep count. And so it is a great privilege for it to be out in the world and for it to be embraced beyond being the first kind of book. I love that people are falling in love with the actual story and language. And I think that is why we fall in love with books, is because the characterizing tropes fall away and we connect heart to heart as human being to human being. And my story is I was born in Bangladesh in 1983. I'm the eldest child of an arranged marriage. I was born to a brilliant father and an equally brilliant mother. I was very, very close to my mother's father, my grandfather. And in Bengali, I would call him Nanabhai, which means grandfather. And so much of my concept of who I am was because of the way he spoke to me about me. And so I Am Yours is dedicated to my grandfather. And the line I say is, to Nanabhai, who wrote my truth into being.
Wow.
It is so important, right? It is so important for children to be given a concept of themselves that is positive, because and that is delivered to them by someone they hold in great esteem and respect. Who knows the person I would have become had my grandfather not given me this prophecy, this vision he had of me. Yeah. And because simultaneously, the same summer that I read about myself with this name that means independence in Bengali, that same summer, a cousin 20 years my senior from my father's side of the family tried to molest me. And I was thankfully able to get away from him. And I reported that story.
Wow.
And I was told that this sort of thing happens, that boys will be boys, and it is best that I keep this story silent. And in that moment, I learned this is how abuse culture works. Abuse culture thrives on the silencing of children's and women's voices. And the other thing that happened was perhaps because I had just been told a month before by my grandfather that I was born to be a woman who speaks for independence, on subterranean level, that was occurring. Because of that, I also vowed that I would be the first one in my family to break the trauma loop of silence, and that I would grow up to be a voice for the stories and souls that had been ritually silenced through generations in my family. And then when I was 18 years old, I was stalked by a teacher in my high school. And again, I reported that story only to be silenced once again by the people who were my alleged guardians in the school system, the administration. My high school principal told me that he would take care of things, but he ended up just silencing the story. And
Well,
I was
he
sent
thanks
back
you, right?
yeah, he
He
thanked me
thanks
for
you
being
for
silent.
keeping it quiet.
Right. And I remember thinking I never offered my silence. It was just assumed because, again, silence is extorted out of us so that the powers that be can remain in power. And so all of these stories were occurring at the same time. I had this deep well of fire and resilience that was nurtured in me by people like my grandfather and my mother. My mother, who has always been someone who has advocated for my voice and told me that I was born for a destiny of greatness, a destiny to be a voice for the voiceless. So I graduated from high school and I immigrated to the United States, and I went to Skidmore College to be a women's studies and theater double major. And I moved to New York after graduation, and I became an actress and a model. And when I was 23, I was sexually assaulted by someone I met in the acting industry, actually. And I had to make the decision of whether or not I should report that incident or keep it quiet, lest it threaten my chances at a possible green card. And back then, I was completely by myself on an artist visa in New York. My entire family was still in Asia. I didn't have a single person whom I could turn to for support or advice. And the little I knew about the immigration system was based on what I know about human bias, which is there are so many people who are so willing to hold assault against a woman, right? And to, on some subconscious level, hold it against me. And so I didn't want my case to land in the hands of that one immigration officer who would believe that women should be punished for the crimes placed upon our bodies. The threat of human bias and the threat of victim blaming and the very real reality of victim blaming is such a huge reason why women don't report the assaults committed upon our bodies. It is not fear that holds us silent. One of the reasons that women stay silent is because we have been given so much information through other experiences that to let us just accept the grim reality that just by speaking out doesn't mean that you're going to get justice. And so at all those turning points, we sit in the dark weighing our options. And that's how I found myself when I was 23. And I just stored that story away as deeper reason to keep working so that I could arrive to a stage in my career where I would have the platform to change things from the inside out. So that this isn't a reality women have to accept anymore. So that bias in the justice system is no longer a reality women have to contend with.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, there's a significant portion of the book that covers your marriage.
Right.
And I feel like there's some core lessons that you pull out of that experience too.
Right.
Like you mentioned about bullying and things like that.
Right.
Could you tell us about that section of your story?
Yeah. And so that section comes pretty much right after these experiences of assault. I met the man who became my husband when I was 25. And we fell in love very quickly because of, now in hindsight, I can tell, because of all of the conditioning I had been put through and the conditioning he had been put through. We kind of had this tumultuous, passionate love affair that within 7 months we were married. He is American, and he was born and raised with every privilege under the sun, including being treated like America's almighty son, you know, white, privileged, wealthy background. And I idolized him. And now in hindsight, I can see that because so much of my childhood and teenagehood, I never felt like I belonged, or I was only on the outskirts of society. I was always that one lonely Bangladeshi girl, this brown girl who was never loved by the popular white boys. And so if you can't be Barbie, your next biggest aspiration is to gain the love and admiration of Ken. But very quickly, that consumptive form of love revealed itself to be a very toxic kind of love that was based on control and dominance. And so I think, you know, many women, I hope, if their husbands started to behave this way, they'd just put their foot down and say, hell no, I'm not putting up with this. But for me, I had been trained to endlessly forgive and be compassionate and understanding toward a man's toxic behavior.
I want to lean into that some
Right.
because when you talk about abuse,
Right.
like when you say you would hope that most people would put their foot down
Right.
as soon as that happens, but the thing that you're talking about seems like it happens so subtly that
Did.
it may happen to people without them even realizing it. And on top
Completely.
of that, what I also would love for you to comment on too is that, like, you're talking about abuse, and I think that most people associate abuse with physical violence.
Right.
But the things that you're talking about are not about, you know, being, you know, punched or thrown around or grabbed.
And that's why I always say there is a whole section in I Am Yours where I talk about the difference between physical abuse and emotional abuse, and how with physical abuse, it is, every bruise is like a receipt that you can hold up and say, here's the violence. I now have proof and permission to leave, or at the very least to feel angry on my own behalf. And, you know, it's this emotional warfare that becomes really toxic and really manipulative. People who are emotional abusers are generally very, very cunning and intelligent. They're generally people who have an amazing capability over language, because language is the thing that they use. It is no accident or coincidence that the way I started retaliating was my human instinct kicked in and it told me to start writing. And I started writing first as a way to hold him accountable to his words. But then it became my own fortification. The more intelligent I grew, and the more articulate I became, the more threatened he grew. And the more successful and the more articulate and commanding over my voice I became, the better I was doing in my career too, because my confidence was growing. And so I started booking bigger and bigger acting jobs. And again, the more threatened he became by my success, and the more threatened he became, the more abusive he attempted to be. Until one day he evicted me from our home. He called me up while I was babysitting and he said, don't come home. And so all I had was those 2 changes of clothes, my laptop, a newly discovered voice, and $60. And I was homeless, but I was also euphoric with purpose. And I realized this wasn't a rejection, it was release. And I realized that if my writing had given me the grit and strength I needed to exit a toxic situation, I had a social responsibility to lean into and develop that body of work so that I could write a book and publish a book and publish other things and be part of other projects that would give other people a chance to their freedom.
There's also something else that comes up for me too as we talk about abuse, as I read about abuse, and
Right.
that is that, you know, and we talk about this in the larger conversation that we had about how you mentioned the things that you name are not those overt physical acts of violence,
No.
but it's also that abuse kind of is on a spectrum, right? Like,
Right.
you know, and so it's not just that like this binary, which I think also ties into, you know, us talking about like, is this person the devil or are they a person in the type of world that creates that kind of, you know, behavior without excusing them for that behavior, but also taking that into a factor and giving you hope to do something. Anyway, it's not just this binary where it's like you are a terrible person and you've done things to harm people, or you have never ever done something like that in your life and therefore you're a good person. But
Exactly.
there are all kinds of people, and the way that we behave and relate to one another sometimes can be harmful in ways that, you know, in ways that some might say, yeah, that was abusive. And sometimes I don't even think that we even understand that we're in that kind of toxic relationship or we're relating in that unhealthy way.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring up the topic of binary, because the thing about emotional violence is it's all the more genderless, because physical violence, because in general, men's bodies are stronger than women. When a male abuser decides to use physical violence, that's more accessible in their toolkit than for a female abuser. Unless that female abuser is abusing a child, right? And beating up a smaller human body. But emotional abuse is something that all genders have equal access to, because it comes down to verbal and psychological manipulation. And that's why, you know, I Am Yours is written directly to the reader. And what I mean by that is the first two words of I Am Yours is Dear Love. And I write the entire 300-page book as though it is a continual love letter that I'm writing to my reader. And I guide you through this, really using this very tender and loving voice. I guide the reader through these experiences that I have gone through in the most gentle voice, so that that gentleness helps you uncover memories of your own traumatic situations. And that gentleness, the language, then helps you come to terms and closure and healing of those similar experiences that you may have gone through. And all of this is architected with a very specific intention for this to be a manual of healing that is available and applicable for any human being, regardless of gender, regardless of race. And I know that this voice of gentleness and compassion and love is a very important part to why so many of my readers are male, because I never once use an angry voice that says us versus women versus men, or that this is a male problem. Abuse is a male problem. No, it's not. Emotional abuse in particular is so so many women are capable of it. So all of this together is why the book is constructed in the way it is, on a craft, structure, voice, and thematic way.
Okay, so as I was reading, and I don't know the name of your ex-husband, but I remember reading and putting the book down several times and going, "This guy sounds like a dick." but you don't write about him like he's a dick.
Thank you.
You write honestly about what happens, but you don't ever just say like, this guy's a derelict of a person.
No,
you know?
I never did, because, and for numerous reasons. First of all, my integrity would never allow me to say that about any human being. And I also believe that if you shame a person, you basically annihilate their chances of growth, which is to say, if we shame people, we also annihilate society's chance to heal and evolve. So as an artist, my duty is to be of service. So if I use my art to shame people, I am literally betraying my vow as an artist because I cannot be of service if I cut off people's chances to grow.
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
And
that's such an
so,
interesting
yeah.
posture to have in our moment in history, because, you know, we do have a lot of that where the injustices that we're facing are very serious and they deserve attention and they deserve to be spoken about truthfully.
Right.
But I do wonder about that, you know, in the age of, oh gosh, okay, like when I say this, like I don't want anyone to think that I'm defending any of these guys, but
Right.
it's just a question that I have where
Totally.
I think about our Me Too moment where we do need, like, men, we need to be held accountable for all of our, you know, for all of the ways that we are complicit in this system, actively or passively.
Right.
And then I wonder at the same time, like, is there any type of redemption for people who have done things that are unconscionable?
And this is why I wrote the book I did the way I did, which is I write about him with complete transparency and truth through a tone of immense curiosity and compassion for why he did the things he did. Because that's my greater goal as a writer, is to be an investigator into the human condition, to understand why do abusers become abusers? Because no child is born as an abuser. Every child, we are born innocent, and then we become the pain or the love that is modeled to us, right?
Mm. You're holding a couple things in tension in a really interesting way, is that, yes, this happened.
Right.
And still allowing that person to be a whole person,
Yes.
without that being the only thing there is to know about
Exactly.
them. But also holding your own boundaries and saying, just because I can understand how they got there doesn't mean that I should be with them in that.
Completely.
You know?
And so again, to like come back to the Me Too movement. So what's our goals with any kind of larger social justice and progress? Progress is the goal, right? It's not just about creating all of this noise and giving voice to our rightful rage and the grief we have felt toward our wounds. That has a place, but that is the beginning of the conversation so that we can set up the conversation that these are the things that happened. Now what? What are our takeaways that we need to understand about those who abuse so that we can make better choices in the way we parent our young men, in the way we interact with men, in the way, and in the way as women we hold our own in relationships. Like the pivotal point in my first marriage wasn't, oh, the day he started being unkind. The pivotal point came on the day when I learned the power of my no and the authority of my yes, right? That in all instances of demoralization, I was complicit as well in many ways because I let him walk over me. For a long time, I was subservient. I kept myself small lest I overwhelmed him, right? And so understanding my complicity also let me understand the power I would have were I to behave contrary to that. I reclaimed ownership over my narrative. In an abusive relationship, what happens is your abuser becomes the voice in your head, which is to say, they become the voice directing your narrative. And by writing, I reclaimed authority over that narrative. I became once again the author of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I hear in what you're saying. So in my language in social movements and talking about change, people tend not to challenge the status quo until they have a type of cognitive liberation.
Right.
Where
Absolutely.
they understand two things. They come to see the situation that they're in as both unjust and changeable.
Right.
But they have to see both.
Yes.
Like,
No, that's a great point. And I came into cognitive liberation by writing, and then I started to realize, like, well, that I had to make a plan to come up with the other ways to legally liberate myself from the situation.
Yeah.
It would be impossible for me to initiate a divorce. His ego would not allow me to leave him unless he thought it was his own idea.
So said that you started liberating yourself through your writing, and so I feel like it's important. What story did you start writing?
Yeah, and so I was writing just nonfiction. I was writing essays that were basically about our daily life, and also by writing about these things, accidentally, it helped me uncover a lot about my parents' marriage and my father's personality, and what could have led him to be the way he was with my mother, which was very, very similar to my ex-husband. And so when I was writing all of these new sentences that were in my own voice, it was empowering on so many levels. And I started recognizing that I was sitting on this kind of intelligence that I had never utilized before. And that there was more to me than being someone's wife, and there was more to me than being someone's hired actress.
And you mentioned a few times, like you emphasized, like
Right.
you were reciting the words of white men that as a Bangladeshi woman, you know, and you highlight that in the book. And I wonder,
Right.
you know, for some people, it's just, okay, here's another person that wrote a book or whatever. But
Right.
I wonder if it feels symbolic to you, like
Mm.
the way that your career has evolved and the work that you're doing, and it all is around the voice. Like, is there deeper meaning
Absolutely.
specifically because of the racial dynamics there?
Absolutely. I am cognizant of the fact that when I was 11 years old, my grandfather, a man whom I respected, admired like a god, told me that I was born to be a woman whose name means independence. And almost simultaneously, I was stalked by a predator. And I was told boys will be boys and that this happens. And I made a vow that I would use those two things to be a tireless voice for justice and resilience for the very voices that have been ritually silenced by society. And so that to me is where I get my ambition. That to me is where I get my positivity in the face of adversity, because I am cognizant of my why, and I'm cognizant that my existence works on a historical and symbolic level. My refusal to die, my refusal to give up means so much. And I have a duty to continue. Toxic power cannot exist without our fear, which is to say that the more confidently, bravely, and loudly we insist on existing and speaking, that in itself is a riot. That in itself is a revolution. And that in itself gives other people a toolkit to do their own rising. Here I am, a woman who, I was literally a women's studies major, highly educated college graduate. And yet I was a girl who, for the longest time, believed the narrative that had been spoon-fed to me. Patriarchy does not want me to exist. My confidence, my authority over my voice, my success threatens the entire infrastructure of patriarchy and white privilege that says someone who looks like me and comes from my heritage should not be commanding so much attention. Right? I just love that. Right? And here I am, loudly existing.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
Okay, so Corey, thoughts?
Yes. Man. So many thoughts. I mean, her story is so amazing.
Yeah.
You know what? I just, gosh, I wrote so much stuff down. I don't even know where to begin. Where do you want to start with thoughts on what we just heard?
Oh, okay. Well, here's the question, because this is something I think about too, and usually when I'm talking to other people about Reema's book and her work, a lot of times I'm talking to other men, and so I'm always curious about how men experience, how they experience her, because she's talking about. Okay, let me just I'll highlight a couple of things.
Okay.
When she talks about her being in school and her talking with like the principal about what, about this older man who tried to take advantage of her or whatnot. And he says, "Thank you for being quiet about this."
Yeah.
And she says, I never offered my silence, you know? Well, she
Right.
didn't, she said, she said that's what she was thinking, that she never offered her silence. And, she talks about her marriage, her former marriage in New York, and about the little things that he would do. Sometimes some of those things were really big, but when I read those kinds of things, there are a couple things that happen for me. First off, I do a bit of a check on myself and go,
Hmm.
are there ways in which I feel so small and insecure around the women in my life or around my partner that in some ways I try to dim their light, right?
Mm. Mm.
Because I think the interesting thing about the way that Reema talks about um, patriarchy and toxic masculinity in her book is she illustrates it. And she
Mhm.
illustrates how subtle it can be.
Mm.
And she illustrates how it's almost like there's an unspoken agreement that this is just what we're doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
like with the story about the principal, and then the subtlety of, I mean, it's not subtle. I want to like backtrack. Like, it's not subtle for a man to tell his wife or to ask his wife to change, her clothes or to wipe the makeup off her face. Like, that's not
Right.
subtle, you know?
Right.
And at the same time, I don't think that everyone understands that as abuse,
Well, and it might, and I think had we not had the context of her book and hearing her story, inside that context, these things that happen sound egregious, but I wonder how it would sound if you hadn't heard her story or read her book, because it's so woven into men to dominate and be patriarchs, and
Mm,
that like, would we think that those things were abusive had she not used her voice and
yeah,
raised, the sound of the alarm on it, if you will, to say, hey, this is not okay. Now, I'd like to think that I
right.
would understand that, but I wonder if there was a season in our lives as men, because of how we are raised, because of the environment we grow up in, that like we think things are just normal until someone who is on the other side of that thing goes, nah, that's not okay at all.
I've noticed two things like that are really simple, but I hear women talk about them and then I catch myself doing them. And I'm
Mm.
trying to be better about this. One thing is that I noticed that some of my friends that are women, when we're talking, they're much less likely to interrupt me, cut in and make their point,
Mm.
as I'm making my point. I do that
Mm.
far more often than they do, you know? Um, and the other thing that I noticed too, and this is one of my mentors, her name is Laura Lee. Laura Lee told me that, she'll be in meetings sometimes. And as soon as she picks up her phone, I know, as soon as she starts talking, like men will pick up their phone and start like doing whatever, like we don't know what they're doing. They might be texting or checking Facebook or whatever. Um, and I notice, I hate to admit it, but I've caught myself doing that sometimes, like being in a group or being in a meeting, and
I,
I laugh because I go in my head like, oh my God, am I doing this right now? Because that's literally the thought that I've had before.
mm.
When a woman in the group will start talking, and I'm gonna check Facebook now.
Yeah, I mean, dude, I think it makes me kind of wonder about the structures um, that we've grown up in, that we live in, and do they, for all of us, create our roles that we sort of naturally fill in and fall into, no matter how conscious we may be. And I think we're all in this process of trying to learn and grow and be better. But like, sometimes I feel like I just naturally fall into positions. Like, as an example, on the flip side of that, there are lots of times where I'll be talking with white men who will interrupt me far more than I'll interrupt them, because
Uh-huh.
it's almost like we naturally fall into our position in the hierarchy before we have a
Right.
chance to consciously go, I want to be fully present in this room as someone who's mindful of the other person's dignity. I hope that makes sense, but that's just kind of what I heard when you were talking about that. Like, it feels like it's such a natural thing.
Well, they say that, by the time we're like 4 or so, like we already know what kind of world that we live in, you know?
Dang.
So that's why you can give a child, and you remember this test, you can give a child the doll, the black doll and the white doll, and say, which one is prettier, you know?
Wow.
And most of the kids will choose the white doll, right? Because they already know, like this beauty standard, right? They can't articulate it in that way, but they've already caught on to that this is the standard of beauty because of the movies and the television shows and the stories and the stories that they get. And so I mean we're talking about like really subtle ways that even us being socialized kind of into the, as Bell Hooks would say, the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Um, we're we've kind of identified some really subtle ways, and I see how that can play out in some larger ways. When we get into relationship, and into the more extreme examples. And you mentioned, I think, before about just kind of stories.
Mm.
Masculinity is a story, femininity is a story,
Yeah, it
and
is.
how genders interact and all that. And we have kind of a dominant story that says, and I don't know if you felt this pressure, but I have felt this pressure, right? Like, especially as a black man, actually. I mean, I don't know how white people talk about their relationships, but I know that black people as a group in America uh, tend to be we tend to lean a bit more conservative, you know. Um,
Uh,
and so I've heard a lot about gender roles, and about what a man is supposed to do and what a man is supposed to be.
yeah.
A man is supposed to be the head of his household
Yes.
and all this other kind of stuff.
Yeah. You grew up hearing that too. And I had to, so as you know, I've been married now for 20 years. Well, I'm in year 21 right now. And I had to unlearn a lot of the things that came from, I think you're right, being conservative, black and conservative, but also being, Christian. There's this, like,
Hmm.
you're the head of the household that's kind of woven in. So whenever we would have to make major decisions, it was just sort of naturally assumed that I would lead the way. And I've had to unlearn that with even my wife. And it's been like times where you you find yourself in this new space where you're like, okay, well, how do I make space for both of us to be co-partners and me not to have the dominant sense of I'm the man, when I come home, there should be food and the house should be clean, all those sorts of things that, like, just sort of, again, the story that's told to us
Right.
when we're younger about what it means to be a man and what it means to be in a relationship.
Did you ever buy into like all of that? Like, a man is supposed to be strong and tough and, obviously head of the household thing, and but also kind of the machismo of all of that. Was that ever something that you felt like, you know, you needed to attain?
I 100% bought into that. I was, I've been an athlete, so in athletics and competition, this term "man up" that is
Hmm.
used, so I definitely bought into
Yeah.
that, like, sense of that man up meant to win. It meant to
Yeah.
dominate. It meant to be better than the person in front of you. And that doesn't stay on a basketball court or a football field. That mentality is woven into a man, so much so that, like, when you are at a boardroom table and someone in front of you is talking, if it seems that that person is in a lesser role in the hierarchy, of course you're going to man up and assert your dominance, and
Mm.
talk over or try to outdo or ignore because what they're saying doesn't really matter because they're not in the position that you are in the hierarchy. And so I'm definitely bought into it. And it is, I mean, it's hard. And I think this is why, and I know we're not talking about white folks, but this is why I sometimes have little patience for white folks, because it's not like they're the only people being asked to reevaluate the way that they were taught to be and move and be in the world.
Right.
Because
Yes.
you and I as Black men are also having to learn and relearn things about gender, about our role as men,
Right.
about all of those
Mhm.
things. And we're having to learn and be uncomfortable and ask questions and sit back and listen. And so that makes me go look at white folks and go, yeah, you're not the only people that have to do this.
Well, right. I mean, so much of this is connected,
Yeah,
and I think that this is a part of what we talk about when we talk about being intersectional and understanding the way that we carry multiple identities. That in some ways, when it comes to white people, like Black people are marginalized by white people, but when it comes to Black men, like we can at least try to
right.
participate in the patriarchy to some degree, and we can, and to some degree, over certain groups of women, we can actually, exercise some forms of supremacy and or dominance, right?
Yeah,
And it's important for us to understand. But I get your point. Like when you're talking to white people about white supremacy, it's like they just hear, well, I'm bad. Like you're just telling me I'm a bad person through and through, and then they shut down. And speaking of shutting down, um, I think that one of the stories. So I want to say that I never bought into masculinity in a conscious way.
Hmm.
So I didn't feel consciously that like I have to attain to this ideal of manhood. But I still ingested those messages and those stories, and I still would find myself at times acting out of that story. So
Hmm.
there's so many ways that we could talk about this, but one thing that has come up for me as we've been talking is that I feel like sometimes I have felt rather that in order to be the man that that is introduced to us when people say you're not a man, when people
Right.
emasculate you,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
In order to be that guy, that men have to die inside.
Hmm.
That's how I feel, and that's why I bucked against it uh, as a young person. And I'll make the point again every time that I say that I wasn't really interested in being that guy. That there were still ways that I tried at different points,
Hmm.
even though I wasn't doing it with intention. But anyway, to be that guy, you have to have a very limited range of emotions. It's actually the only emotion you're allowed to have is anger,
For
right?
sure. Yeah.
Um, you're not
It's the
supposed to
only helpful
cry.
one. Nope.
Yeah,
Never.
you're definitely not supposed to cry. Um, you know,
Yeah.
and be sensitive and to be emotionally honest or to have like this full range of emotions. But see, here's the destructive part of that too. So I experienced that from men, but I also experienced that from women,
Uh,
you know, who would also, say things like, "You're not a man because, of me expressing, that larger range of emotions." And so I don't say that to blame it on women, but I say that we all in some ways participate in the patriarchy in the same way
yes.
that sometimes Black people participate in white supremacy, right?
Absolutely.
So anyway, the
Absolutely.
destructive side, and I think that people want to toughen you up because in order to be that guy, the the man who is implied when people tell you you're not a man,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
like that
Hmm.
guy has to be tough. He has to be able to win a fight, right?
Yes.
He's you remember
Yes.
Mark Driscoll used to talk about this when he was like, the guys in the Bible, they were dudes, tough as nails, win a fight, dudes, you know right? And everyone's just so
That's-
afraid that you're going to be a quote unquote sissy or you're going to be quote unquote gay, which is a part of the
yes.
patriarchy. Just going to
Exactly.
say that in passing. Maybe we'll come back to it. Um, but I remember like one time I was standing, and I've told this story before, but just as a kid, standing and I rested my hand on my hip. And my older sister, she's like 10 years older than me. Her boyfriend looked at me and was like, "Don't hold your hand on your hip like that."
Mm-mm.
It's not like that level of policing to
Yeah,
make
man.
sure that you can be that guy and you
Yes.
can win a fight. And the thing that they're trying to do is make you someone that can protect a woman. Um, but the destructive side to that, although that, I mean, maybe I've just implied that that's not destructive in itself. The destructive side to that is if you only have access to your anger, like that's the only thing that you know how to express and that you feel is okay to express, then when you get into a relationship with someone, whether it's romantic or otherwise, like you don't know how to give voice and to articulate all the other experiences that you're having.
Yes, yeah, exactly. What is that quote? If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think that's what it goes.
Yes,
No, I
exactly.
think that
Exactly.
as men, we kind of have that, like, anger is the tool we have to express ourselves, to win, to achieve victory. And I'd say in my own life, man, as a father of daughters, I find myself struggling with the tension of being strong, and also expressing vulnerability, because
Yeah.
as they become teenagers, they want less and less to do with their dad. I become more and more annoying. I'm more gross. All these other things. It just happens, right? So, I'll go to their room and I'm a bother. So as a man, I go into anger
Mm,
instead of being as a father going, you guys are hurting my feelings. I
right.
struggle with saying to my daughters, it hurts
Yeah.
my feelings that you don't like to be around me,
Yeah.
because that doesn't feel like the kind of emotion or range of emotion that a man should display for their daughter. So I'm
You're not
constantly in that
allowed to have
tension.
your feelings hurt as a man.
Exactly. Exactly. You're not.
You're not allowed to say that sentence.
You're not. You're not. And so I've learned to say to my daughters, my feelings are hurt. And it's very uncomfortable to say it, but it's something I'm going, it's true. It's authentic. It's what's happening. It's what I'm experiencing. And I want them to know that men can have their feelings hurt as well.
Right.
To sort of deconstruct this idea that men are just bruisers.
Right. I want for people to realize that men can have their feelings, period.
Right.
You
Exactly.
know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm so glad that like you're in this conversation too, because you're married and you have daughters.
I'm in a house full of women,
And
like full
that's a
of women.
perspective that I just don't have.
Right. And you know what? And you know how we all sort of, like you said, participate in these structures, and in subtle ways. Whenever I
Yeah.
have gone to speak places, I've done this several times. I will say, I'll put a picture of my family up and I say, here's my beautiful family. It's my wife, Julie, and my 3 daughters. I live in a house full of women. Y'all pray for me. Like
Oh,
that joke, right? That's like a common joke, and everybody laughs. Oh, ha ha ha! And it's
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
why do I need now? There are moments that it is difficult, and where, like, I can understand the comedy of being a guy and having being outnumbered when it comes to, like, preference and things like that.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
and my wife and daughters love to spend a ton of time with them all. I do not. But that is not
Mhm.
necessarily inherently mean, just without me telling you those specifics about our family dynamic. Just the fact that there's a male with a bunch of women should not necessarily mean that you should pray for me. But I just have
Yeah.
naturally participated in that way of thinking.
But we don't talk about men that way, right? We just don't make those kinds of jokes about dudes, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
And so I think that is actually telling, like it is in a way it's harmless, right? And in another way, I think that it's very telling about the kind of society that we live in. And I
Yeah.
also thought, like when you said that, like what would it mean for us to inverse a joke like that, right? And to say like, so I live in a house full of women, so pray for them.
And and you know what? That is so enlightening, because what that does is takes the emphasis off of me. It's so, because the first version is, I'm the hero of the story. You guys pray for me. The second
Uh-huh.
version is, I am the antagonist. So pray for them. And
Mm.
I think that is flipping the story that society tells us about patriarchy on its head, and saying the patriarchy is not the victim. It's certainly is not the hero. It's like it's a different narrative, and I like it.
Yeah, the truer story, I mean, the true story is that like women are not a burden to men, like as a
No,
group, right? Like,
no, it's not.
you know,
Not at all.
as a group. Yeah, women are not a burden to men. but as a group, we have put women through a lot of stuff.
For sure.
And continue to do so. I think what I was just getting at earlier is something that Bell Hooks talks about in her essay, Understanding Patriarchy. And that is that patriarchy is a system that advantages men. And yet, all of us in some way are trained to uphold it. So it takes I think it's going to take a lot of intention for all of us to understand the ways that, we have internalized these messages about who should have about male dominance, basically. The idea that that men should just have more space and more power and more say.
Yeah.
And speaking of Bell Hooks, in that essay, something that stood out to me, and it still sits with me. She says that there's been no mass movement to liberate men from patriarchy.
Dang.
And it's so interesting because usually when we think about these oppressive systems or dominant systems, we always think about the people who are affected by that, the people who are kind of under the boot of that system.
Yeah.
And thinking about freeing them, right? Liberating them. And I'm not saying that's wrong. However, like in this, men are controlled by these ideas about what it means to be a man, and we need to be freed from those stories. And I'm not saying that that's the work of women. I think that that's our work, to talk about that with one another and to have these conversations like now. It reminds me of another scholar who talks about this, and I could use this as an allegory for white supremacy, where he says that racism is used to control the behavior of whites, right? It's the fact that people who think that they are white have internalized these messages of superiority, and they're enacting them in their individual exchanges and also, in any place where they're holding power and stuff like that. And I think that's the point that I'm making too about male supremacy, is that it's appropriate that we talk about women's rights. We also need to talk about how men can have a healthier view of what it means to be a man. Okay, I just need to name something. As we're talking about this, I feel so insecure.
Same, man. Because you don't want to dishonor people when you're talking about masculinity and toxic masculinity and women. It's when there's not women present to sort of help know if you've wandered into some problematic territory. It feels insecure. It's not. I think. For me, and I think I could say for you also, I don't think it's kind of insecurity. It's like, I don't want to look bad. It's more, I don't want to dishonor women who may be listening or just women in general by just being a dude.
Yeah, I don't want to dishonor anyone. And I think, honestly, it's a vulnerable position to talk about this as someone who, participates in the patriarchy, right? And to know that I have blind spots here, right? And to know that, like, I'm running my mouth and I'm probably exposing them.
For sure.
Well, and this is partly what I appreciate about Reema too, is that she's very gracious about dealing with men. Like when you read I Am Yours, she writes it kind of as like a love letter.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of women have gotten so much out of reading the book because of the way that she shares. But she's also she's very honest. She's very truthful in the way she illustrates these unhealthy, encounters with men. But she also really does believe that she does believe that men have to participate in this movement, and so she wants to speak graciously to men and to invite them into that movement. Which, I mean, she's better than me because
right.
Like I am not really concerned so much with how white people feel about how we talk about anti-racism. But Reema does care about how men feel as she's talking to us about patriarchy.
Yeah, she does. And she doesn't really make men and not even her abuser, her ex, she doesn't even make him out to be this evil or morally corrupt, or in your words, this derelict of a person. Like she views this story, and to me, like an anthropologist views a human behavioral trait, and just goes
hmm
very objectively, zoomed out, looks at it and says, here are the factors that lead to this thing. Now let's talk about this thing.
Well, she keeps his full humanity in view,
Yeah, she does.
right? Um, and I don't know if that comes with, years being, with time being removed from it. Um, but she does connect it in her book when she says, my father was a bully. I married a bully. And when we're bullied, we become bullies to ourselves. Right. And she's connecting this in this much larger story in a way that doesn't excuse the behavior at all.
Right.
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 But also holds that, this person, it's just like they say, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
I've been on the receiving end of abuse, and I remember thinking about. I mean, I have thought about those people as even in what they did, it wasn't what they intended to do, and it doesn't excuse it at all. But I can understand, like, this person was raised in this kind of family, in this kind of context where they didn't have exposure and the resources to actually love me the way that I needed to be loved, or love me in a healthy way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I loved that she, when you talk about like her father, but I love that when she talked about her grandfather, and
Yeah.
that was huge to me. And I don't remember the exact term, or at least know how to say it, but the term, the word that meant who wrote my truth into being was
Oh yeah.
like, that was just so powerful, because
Yeah.
she was given a gift from her grandfather, that he
hmm
deposited something in her really young, saying, you are powerful, you are strong, you deserve to take up space in the world. And I thought about, like, someone close to me in mine and my wife's family, who once told me that if their grandmother had not died, their life would have turned out different. And this person I'm talking about in our family, man, really struggled with substance abuse, and had a
Yeah.
pretty shitty life. Um,
Yeah.
and she looks back at that and says, if someone would have been a voice in my life and was able to continue to be that voice in my life would have turned out differently. And I thought that whole story of her grandfather was just so powerful.
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, it's almost like it was almost prophetic in what he did. Like
Yeah.
he saw that, and when you meet Rima, she in some ways she feels like she just appeared one day. Like she just appeared fully formed. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I mean, she has a lot of love for people in general. She has this just big heart and big energy to just love and help people. Like you talk to her for the first time and you feel like you've been friends forever. Um, but it's so interesting to see that, right? Like he named that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say he gave it to her, but he saw it,
Yeah.
right? And he called it out. And to see that, that really is who she is. She is, I mean, she's a force.
Yeah, for sure.
And she's trying to help others understand that, you can also, no matter what you've been through, like you can also use your voice and you can inspire others like she's doing now.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, that's our show. Thanks for listening, everyone. As always, we love having these conversations with you, and we hope that you'll join us for the next one. Our editor is Ross Montgomery. We're going to start shouting out Ross at the end to let you know. Shout out to all of our wonderful supporters on Patreon. And if you're not a supporter on Patreon, just know that Patreon supporters get the unedited versions of these episodes, and they get them early.
Ooh, not close.
We'll see you next time.
We're not living in your fantasies. Your Daffy Duck and your Bugs Bunny. Wearing clothes that we cannot.
Thank you for listening today. If you like what you heard and you haven't already, please subscribe on your favorite podcatcher. Leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts also helps us get into more ears and minds. This podcast is made possible by our fantastic patrons. Thank you for being a part of our work at Hope and Hard Pills. As usual, you'll get the uncut extended version of this episode on Patreon. If you want to join in on the work on our Patreon community, just look us up at patreon.com/Andre Henry. To go deeper, get subscribed to our email newsletter. Head over to andrerhenry.com and click Join the Movement, where you'll get practical insight on anti-racism and social change every week. And you'll never miss a new article, song, or podcast episode. You can also follow Andre Henry on Facebook and Instagram at The Andre Henry. That's all for this episode of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. See you next time. Peace.